Hey guys, welcome back from the break. Now we're going to be talking about of paradise and power, and we're going to try to understand what this book's telling us. And it's pretty much by the end of the day that Americans are from Mars and Europeans are from Venus. When we talk about power, the conception of power, the efficacy of power, the morality of power, and this reality of power. And obviously it has a huge impact on the strategies, the strategic choices that Americans and Europeans make when working in international arena, when deciding about international politics, foreign policy. And why do they have a different view on power? What Robert Kagan is telling us here, it has to do with the power gap. By the end of the day, the power both sides of the Atlantic have is what determines how they perceive it, how willing they are to use it, and how desirable this is, and whether this is the preferred strategy or not. And why is there a power gap? And this is history, because actually originally, and this is quite interesting, if we go back 200 years ago, it will be the other way around. European countries will be the power, the superpowers, the puissance, and the US, on the other hand, will be just the opposite, more liberal, more values, more soft power. But this change. And he says that it started changing after World War I. And at this time, Europe was already talking about de-escalation. Remember just how Adolf Hitler was able to, not to rise to power, but how other countries in Europe were not willing to interfere with Adolf Hitler, not even when he invaded Poland, but it was only when France and then the Benelux was affected, and later on that they were willing to participate, to engage in conflict when it was unavoidable anymore. So already at that time, we start talking in the in-between wars period. We're already talking about how there's a power gap and how we have a different conception of power, and even more after World War II. After World War II, Europe was completely destroyed, and it finds no use on developing superpowers once again. Why? Because they find themselves in between two hegemons that are competing with each other, but they have no incentive to do so. We'll talk about later about incentives and why they do it, but at the end of the day, Europe is fine in that position. There's no threat. Power is not part of the strategy at that time. And obviously, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when everyone understands that the dividends of peace are to be collected, while Europe is able to do so in a sense, it fails with Yugoslavia because it doesn't have the power to interfere in that conflict. But Europe does reduce military spending after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But the US eventually, even though at the beginning it seemed it will be, but it does not. Why? Because there are other conflicts that as a world leader, so to say, the US gets involved in. For example, we're talking the war in Iraq, later the war in Afghanistan, second war in Iraq, etc. etc. So actually this results in having different military capabilities. Why? Because this power also reinforces the positions you are in. And this is what he tells us about, the psychologies of power and weakness. And these two sentences are fantastic. Obviously the first one, we know when you have a hammer, all problems start looking like nails. And this is what happens to the US. It does have the hammer, it does have the military capabilities, it does have the power. So every problem seems to be able to be fixed with power, with hard power. While the other way around, it's also true. When you don't have a hammer, you don't want anything to look like a nail. Why? Because you're not able to solve the problem. If you have a nail, you cannot confront that nail. And this is what happens to Europe, and that's why Europe pushes so much for diplomacy and pushes so much for soft power, economic intervention. These can be perfectly seen throughout history. We were saying that the power gap already started after World War I, and this shows really well during the Cold War itself. I mean, if you remember in the history classes, we were saying about how the tent was the exception to the rule that escalation was a rule between the Soviet Union and America throughout the Cold War, and how even actually some academics argue that it was because of this strategy of confrontation and this arms race that made the Soviet Union to fail to keep the pace of the US, and that's why it eventually collapsed. But if you remember from these classes, Europe was actually taking a very different approach. Do you remember, for example, Ostpolitik? That was Willy Brandt, the Chancellor of Germany, that tried to not reunite, but kind of de-escalate the situation in between West and East Germany, and also how, well, we didn't talk about these, but de Gaulle eventually also talked about de-escalating and not confrontating with the Soviet Union. So this was something that already existed during Cold War. And after Cold War, this is even more obvious, and this is quite interesting because I always say that narratives and how we word things affect reality. And these two competing terms are very interesting because, for example, while the US and Bush administration talked a lot about rogue states, in Europe we were still talking about failed states. Why? Because actually, even though it's a similar reality, it suggests different solutions. While a rogue state will require from the power, from the discipline, a failed state will require from aid, economic support. And this is what's happening nowadays in the world. While Europe sees failed states, the US sees rogue states. For example, we can see that nowadays, for example, with Iran. That actually is a topic that you can choose for your final essay presentation, slash presentation. And this is also interesting, another concept that Kagan brings up, whether perfect security is possible or not. And while Europe is willing to accept that perfect security is not possible, the US, because of their role as leaders in the world, so to say, as hegemon, it does not. It does need to provide perfect security. It does need to maximize the capabilities to achieve that goal. However, this is not only a psychological issue, it's also a practical reality. Why? Because why will Europe not invest in power? It's not only because they perceive, because of this background, everything is non-nails, so to say, but it's also because actually if there was any nail, they wouldn't need to have the hammer, as the US was providing the hammer for free for them. So there was no real need. You could always free ride. You can always take advantage of that American power because of NATO, thanks to NATO. And actually also that, because of the power differences, that made the US a primary target. Remember, we were talking about Iraq. European countries were not worried about mass destruction weapons because it wasn't likely that Saddam Hussein, if he had had mass destruction weapons, was going to target Europe at all whatsoever. If there was any chance of him targeting anyone, it would have been the United States because of their role of hegemon in the world. So what's in this for Europe and for the US? On the one hand, for Europe is to build a world that is based on soft power, on economic development, on diplomacy, commercial ties. Why? Because then Europe does have the capabilities to actually succeed in that world. It does have the economic power, it does have the values, so to say, to export to these other countries, so Europe can be a leader of the world. But should the US be angry about this? I mean, in a sense, no, because the US has contributed for this world setting. By the end of the day, by allowing Europe to free ride, it has permitted the development of this psychology of power in Europe as well. So what is to be done, according to the author? They are meant to pressure Europe to build a stronger military. This is something that Donald Trump is doing for sure. And realize that Europe is not capable of constraining America. And this is also something that actually Donald Trump has done. If you look at Iran, they have not been constrained at all by the pressure of the European Union. Actually, we were talking in the previous class about France pressuring the US in G9 summit. And actually, there was no change at all in their policy about Iran. So by the end of the day, what the current administration is doing is exactly what of prioritizing power tells Americans to do. Take advantage of their powerful position and do not play the European game, so to say. So this was about it for today's class. Remember to go through the readings. Don't worry, in the pop quiz there's not going to be anything about the optional reading, so make sure to read the other two. And if you have any question, please drop me an email. Remember that in the email yesterday I asked you for confirmation that you were still following the course. So have a nice day, and I'll see you tomorrow once again. Bye.